All right, looks like we are live. This is going to be a stream on the Medievalists article, or I should say, an academic paper linked by the medievalists.net, which you'll have to excuse me, I'm a little under the weather, but I said I would do it. We got to do it. We're going full. We're going full Bill O'Reilly here. Just doing it live. And even though I don't feel well, don't feel the best, Richard must not be slandered. So that's we're going to go over this because this article, or rather, this was a quick article by the Medievalists, and this article claims that Richard is a bad crusader or a bad crusade leader, and in fine fashion blames Richard for all sorts of things, including the sack of Constantinople in 1204. So it's going to be an interesting one to get into. And this article, it links to a paper here. So let me pull this up. We're going to get into this article by a medievalist, and it looks like it was posted 10 years ago. So for 10 years, this has been a top search result. And it links to this paper here, the article on academia.edu, written by this guy, Michael Markowski. Now I have that downloaded, and we're going to pull that up. And the interesting thing about that is that one of the main sources that Markowski uses to write his academic paper is the history of the Holy War. So I am uniquely qualified to discuss that, as I have read it twice in the last several months. Doesn't make me an expert. I'm not saying that I'm the world's foremost expert or anything like that, but certainly exaggerating the source is something that really strikes me, if you will. So before we get into the live stream, let me just make sure everything's good. Let me make sure everything's working here. This is obviously a little bit of a new thing for me here, so looks like, all right, looks like excellent connection. We're live on YouTube. If you want to chat at all, I don't think I can really see any chat on X. So if you want to chat or say anything, you will have to pop into the YouTube channel. It's under the same name, Memory Medieval. And the chat will be going there. And let's make sure that we're rolling on X here so everyone can follow along there. Oh. What the? All right. So there are some people in the chat here, it looks like. Let's see. I'm hosting a live, 16 people. All right. Well, if you're watching, feel free to jump over to the YouTube. If you want to make any comments. I haven't really figured out how to integrate the whole X and YouTube thing. And so in order to stream this on both, I have to use my computer, which means that I can't really be seeing what's on X. So my apologies, but if you want to make any comments, feel free to chat on YouTube, or if you just, maybe I should put a post, or let's see. Let me do this. Let me put, I'm going to retweet the post about the stream here, this one with the Michael Scott office GIF. I'm going to repost that. And if you have any comments or questions, just put them, just comment on that post. It should be at the top of my feed now because I reposted it. And let me know if you have any comments or questions there, and we can go over that. Otherwise, like I said, YouTube is the place to catch it. All right, so thanks for listening. We're going to get into Richard the Lionheart here, and I apologize if I clear my throat. I'm going to try to mute myself, but I'm not feeling well. I have some tea, and we're going to get into this. This is going to be a very an attempted historical deep dive. I will say, as one disclaimer, one thing I didn't do is it's obviously this translation of the history of the Holy War, which I would recommend. It's a primary source. It's written by Ambrose, which was he was some sort of, they think he might have been maybe a monk attached in some religious way to Richard's cohort. It's not exactly clear who he is. But the actual translation of it, let's see, it starts on page 30 and runs to about 190. So it's 160 pages. So I didn't go back through to do a 160-page refutation of this. However, I will say, I think that the medievalists, I'm imploring them to take this article off of their website because it is so terrible. And we'll go over it here. But if they don't want to take it down, then I will happily debate anybody, or let's say we'll have a respectful conversation. I'll have a respectful conversation about why they should take this down or why this article is essentially just propagandistic garbage. Or we'll have a conversation. We'll have a respectful conversation about it. However they would like to do it. We can have a conversation about it because I think, as I will set out to prove here, the article is no good. So let's pull up the article. Okay, so here is Markowski's article. Richard the Lionheart, Bad King, Bad Crusader. This article is an academic paper. This is a full-on academic paper that is on academia.edu, which apparently is available to even be cited by other academic papers. Really just terrible. And we're going to go through the whole thing here, so buckle up. This paper analyzes the impact of King Richard Lionheart of England during his tenure as leader of the Third Crusade. It examines crusade policy and the significance of Richard's decisions to deviate from it. The lack of control which both the church and normative crusading precedents had over him becomes apparent. Richard's failure to take Jerusalem leads to the conclusion that his self-centered, puerile interests in personal adventures destroyed the chance for success of the Third Crusade and thus prolonged warfare. This is the official Reddit take. Most wars have some sort of peace as the ultimate goal. The Third Crusade is no exception, but Richard subverted the goal of peace, despite negotiating the peace truce himself, by turning away from a siege of Jerusalem and toward various other adventures. For example, attacks on Egyptian holdings, border skirmishes, the conquest of Cyprus from the Byzantines. Still, the Lionheart's legend persists from his day to our own to extol chivalrous virtues and courageous action. Indeed it does. This paper presents the other side of the coin in the hopes of approaching a more balanced accurate portrayal of Richard's crusade leadership and of the ends of crusade ideology, which he undermined. So let me just jump into some things that are wrong with the way that this is framed really quick right here, because this is a very dishonest framing, just to start in the abstract. For example, he talks about how Richard subverted the goal of peace by turning away from a siege of Jerusalem and toward various other adventures. So this is saying that instead of just sieging Jerusalem, he turned away. First of all, he mentions the conquest of Cyprus. That was, number one, on the way to the Holy Land. And number two, the reason why he conquered Cyprus was because the nominal king or ruler of Cyprus, sort of rogue elite, Isaac Komnenos of the Byzantine Empire, had captured, or was attempting to capture, I believe, I can't remember if he actually captured or if he was just sort of holding them basically in limbo, his sister and his wife. Like, what are you supposed to do? And when he made demands of Isaac, Isaac basically just told him to go pound sand. So then Richard just gave him what he was asking for in a matter of days. Additionally, Cyprus ended up, as my understanding, proving to be a good base from which supplies could rendezvous on the way to the Holy Land for the rest of the crusade. So even if you want to say that his several day, let's call it a week, his week in Cyprus, even if you want to say like, oh, this is some sort of blight on him, it ended up being a logistical boon for the crusade. So it's totally just silly to lump that in as if this was some sort of escapade that just had nothing to do with anything and was diverting him from getting the whole thing is just ridiculous. And the other way that you can tell, I'll want to point this out. The other way that you can tell that this paper is extremely biased and hostile toward Richard is the way in which it treats the military exploits of Saladin versus Richard. A few pages down here at the beginning of the paper, a couple pages in right here, you will see that he says, Saladin's stupendous victory of the Battle of Hattin. Now, because the explanation here is going to be, I'm just sticking to the facts. We're just sticking to the facts. But he let it slip here because if you're just sticking to the facts, all you have to say is Saladin's victory. You don't have to call it a stupendous victory. Was it a stupendous victory? Because to me, it seems more like it was a loss by Guy of Lusignan and the kingdom of Jerusalem being completely foolish in the way that they moved their army away from water. I mean, I guess you can credit Saladin for that if you'd like, but the point here is that he doesn't have to say stupendous, because if you say stupendous, that has an air of admiration. He's editorializing the facts, if you will. Now, contrast the way that he talks about Saladin's stupendous victory at the Battle of Hattin. Contrast how he talks about that versus how he talks about Richard at the Battle of Jaffa, which the Battle of Jaffa, in my opinion, may be the greatest battle of the medieval period. It's an absolute incredible feat of arms, just a stupendous feat. And here's how he deals with that. This is the paragraph right here. Once again, Richard reiterated the reasons for opposing the siege: water scarcity, lack of manpower. He forced the Crusaders to retreat all the way to the Mediterranean. Here's where he talks about the Battle of Jaffa. After more skirmishing along the coast. So, how are you supposed to interpret this? This is not like a factual analysis. If you're going to refer to Saladin's accomplishments as stupendous and grand, and then you're going to take Richard's accomplishments, which the Battle of Jaffa was what allowed him to negotiate a more favorable, or even to negotiate a peace truce in the first place, which he just said the goal should be peace, but then he refers to the Battle of Jaffa as more skirmishing along the coast. It's really something. So let's get into the paper here. Let's get into this thing. In June 1192, actually, before we get started, let me just check real quick. Okay. We've got, if anybody has anything to say, feel free to type it in the YouTube chat there. Let's check if this is working. Okay, somebody said they're going to check it later. Awesome. It should be available later, I guess. That's the goal, anyway. Here, that's the goal. I don't know. I'll have to figure out how to save it. I guess that'll be if I can save it on X, so you guys can watch it later. So, let's jump into the paper. In June 1192, King Richard led a crusade advance toward Jerusalem. Moving quickly, the army crossed the inland hills without incident. Saracen troops could not contest the advance. The Crusaders felt high in anticipation as they fortified a camp At Beit Nuba, only hours from the holy city, suspense heightened as the poet Ambrose, who was there, related the verses. Ambrose told how a squad of Muslims was spying on crusader movements. From a nearby mountaintop, the king and a small group of crusaders, including the poet, scaled the heights and secured the area. Maybe we'll just kind of, maybe I should just keep reading it. Maybe should I read the whole thing? I didn't really plan this out too well. Got a lot going on. Just squeezing it in here. King Richard himself pursued the Muslims down the valley. Then, having suddenly found himself just outside of Jerusalem, stunned, he stopped and gazed at the city. A century later, Joinville would use the scene as a spur for later crusaders, having Richard hide his head under his tunic and say that one who could not take the city should not be allowed to look upon it. Excuse me 1 second here. The scene presents more questions than answers. It would be fruitless to wonder about Richard's regrets, if he had any regrets, concerning his failure to take the city, and nearly as fruitless. I mean, you can't, this is what I'm saying, you cannot defend this as saying we're just talking about the facts, but then paint Richard in such a way as like, you'd have to wonder about his regrets, if he had any. Concerning his failure to take the city, and nearly as fruitless to multiply anecdotes of his personal. It would be fruitless to wonder about his regrets, and nearly as fruitless to multiply anecdotes of his personal exploits. Yes, let us not talk about his personal exploits. However, to inquire into the nature of his crusading leadership can be useful. It leads to even more interesting and significant questions. What was the goal of this crusade? Did Richard pursue that goal? With what results? And finally, while the destruction resulting from the crusades is well known, to what extent was crusade warfare limited by its own goals and propaganda? The legend surrounding King Richard stands as a paradigm for medieval knighthood at its shining best. A king courageous in battle and courageous in victory. Yet some historians, like William Stubbs, have found qualities in Richard which were at odds with this view. Stubbs' description of the Lionheart is worth quoting: a bad son, a bad husband, a selfish ruler, and a vicious man. Worth quoting. Richardson and Sales have revised Stubbs by arguing that Richard was a noble knight and a grand ruler who, however, had no conception of the relation of financial means to political ends. Stephen Runciman has combined the two interpretations. He describes Richard as a bad son, a bad husband, and a bad king, but a gallant and splendid soldier. Prestwich has taken the revision further, not only claiming wise political leadership for Richard, but also arguing for his careful money management. Recent works by John Gillingham and Anthony Bridge rehabilitate the historical portrayal of Richard at length. Jonathan Riley Smith has held back from the trend of lionizing Richard, depicting him as one of the finest crusade commanders who, however, was vain, devious, and self-centered. Seeing this spectrum of interpretations, James Brundage wrote, "The great problem of interpreting Richard's career, of course, is the question of what standards one should apply to his history. The inquiry here flows strictly from the crusade context. The standards that will be applied to Richard stem from crusaders themselves, from officials who orchestrated the war, and from normative crusading prototypes in Richard's past, which were applied to him in his own day. The point is to examine the evidence concerning Richard as leader of the Third Crusade and to analyze the significance of his failure to take Jerusalem. This inquiry will lead, with an ironic twist, to the issue of peace as an intended goal of crusade warfare and how the Lionheart consistently subverted that goal." What exactly were the goals of the Third Crusade? In 1187, Pope Gregory VIII called the Third Crusade and stated its main goal as recovering the Holy City. Sorry, the scroll is extremely not agile here. And its environs from Saladin. For example, Pope Gregory's model for the Crusaders to follow was that of Maccabees, who succeeded in, as the Pope noted, liberating the people and the holy places in and around Jerusalem. The Maccabees then established a century-long stability for those inhabitants. Peter of Blois, a prolific propagandist of the Third Crusade, fresh from the court of Pope Gregory VIII, wrote a popular treatise entitled, a big long Latin word. Not only does the title emphasize Jerusalem, but the city and its holy places are targeted specifically in this tract nearly 50 times. Peter criticizes the Crusaders for being slow about, as he put it, freeing that land from its grievous persecutions. But if the Crusaders ever did follow through in their commitment to retake Jerusalem, then the ultimate object of the crusade would be achieved: perpetual peace in the land. Peter of Blois had written another crusade tract addressed to Richard's father, Henry II, not only spelled out the goal of freeing Jerusalem, but noted the foremost shrines of the city, the Holy Sepulchre, and the Temple. Another prominent preacher of the Third Crusade and close advisor of Pope Gregory, Cardinal Henry of Albano, not only specified Jerusalem as the goal, but following the standard medieval exegesis of Pharaoh's captivity of the Hebrews, the cardinal equated Egypt to carnal sin as opposed to life and beauty represented by Jerusalem. Ralph Niger's treatise on the Third Crusade consistently places Jerusalem at the center of pilgrimage, crusade, and their mystical interpretations. In spiritual terms, Ralph labeled the city the vision of peace, while Egypt again represented carnal sin. Therefore, Pope and propagandists clearly pointed to one prime object of the Third Crusade, the recovery of Jerusalem, which would then result in peace for Christians in the area. This is sort of an important point to make, that he's saying everybody pointed toward taking Jerusalem, and everybody who wasn't on crusade agreed that just by taking Jerusalem, it would then result in peace for Christians in the area. It's important to understand, which the author, I don't want, this is so poorly written that I do not, and this man is allegedly an academic. It's important to point out that the Pope or the bishops or the people who are selling the crusade or marketing the crusade are, of course, going to say you need to take Jerusalem and that will result in peace for Christians. That's how you talk about it. That's how you would sell it. Of course, they, in the process of their preaching about the Crusades, they're not going to preach about every other detail or logistical requirement necessary for taking Jerusalem, because the point of the initiation and the sales pitch of the crusade is not in all of the specific logistics. It's up to the men who are on crusade to figure out the logistics. You can look to the first crusade. It was basically, hey, we're going to go take Jerusalem. Let's go meet in Constantinople, and then we'll just march down the coast and take Jerusalem. But it was up to the crusading army, the crusaders, to figure out to siege the city of Antioch, to siege Nicaea, to end up fighting at Dorylaeum, or, even after the crusade is victorious, to then go intercept the incoming Fatimid army at, I believe it's Ascalon. I forget where they intercepted the Fatimid, the 20,000 Fatimid army a month after they took Jerusalem. In any case, the point is that, yes, this is what they said, but this is just the general sales pitch. These guys weren't going on the crusade, and they didn't know all the details of the crusade. It's up to the crusaders to achieve that goal. And so it's just important to note, he's using this as in, like, this is your literal playbook. You're supposed to, as a crusader, you're supposed to just go get in a boat, just go straight to Jerusalem and take the city. And if you don't do that, you're a bad crusader. That's essentially the argument that he's making here. But that is a real Reddit tier argument, because number one, those guys are not there. And number two, it's the crusaders who are the ones who are experienced at war and army logistics and those sorts of things, who have to figure out how to make that happen. Of course, as I had posted on X earlier in the week, Richard, of course, they're going to find something to criticize about everyone, right? Of course, the criticism of the First Crusade is look, these guys committed cannibalism at a certain point. This is after not having supplies for weeks or months and taking a city that basically had no supplies. And so, of course, the armchair argument is, well, they should have just starved to death. It's just a very, it's not a silly, I'm sorry, it is a silly, it's not a serious argument is the point. These types of things, they get used as arguments to sort of slander people that are doing things when in reality they're not arguments at all. It will help to survey the events of the Third Crusade. Its immediate cause stemmed from Saladin's stupendous victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, followed by his conquest of Jerusalem. The first European leader to act was King William II of Sicily, who sent much-needed supplies. Let's see if I can... Oh, here we go. If I do this, let me see if I can shrink this a little bit. Oh, no, shouldn't do that because we got that for the window. So if I do this, oh, there we go. Now I can see the YouTube chat a little bit. All right. King William II of Sicily, who sent much-needed supplies to the Latin survivors early in 1188. These survivors first concentrated on defending the few cities that had withstood Saladin's onslaught. Let me double-check that still looks good. All right, we're good. Then opened the first major offensive of the Third Crusade as they attempted to recover the port city of Acre in the summer of 1189. The Emperor Frederick Barbarossa departed Europe in 1189 with, as Riley Smith wrote, one of the largest crusading armies, if not the largest ever to take the field. However, Frederick died en route. His son also died en route, and a small portion of the German army pushed on to assist the siege of Acre. If I recall, it was like 2,000 men who actually arrived, so very minimal amount. King Richard Lionheart was already well behind these others when he finally set out for the Holy Land in 1190. Still, he diverted his crusade army for a year to conquer Sicily. He diverted his crusade army for a year to conquer Sicily from political opponents, then Cyprus from Byzantines. That was a week, during which time, 2 weeks, during which time the deadly siege of Acre continued to put the Crusaders there in desperate need of the armies Richard was using elsewhere. Certainly the king could have pushed straight on to the Holy Land, just as Archbishop Baldwin's English group did while Richard remained in Sicily. Baldwin, a preacher of the Crusade and Archbishop of Canterbury, who had crowned Richard at Westminster, wrote in October of 1190 that although the Crusaders' condition was perilous outside Acre, he hoped for and expected Richard's arrival any day. Still waiting for the king, Baldwin died at that undermanned siege of Acre, as did the English administrator, Ranulph Glanville, along with a great many others. It was a deadly siege. The diversions in Sicily and Cyprus were not included in the directives of the Pope, nor did the leaders. I mean, that's just silly. The diversions were not included in the directive of the Pope. Well, neither were any of the diversions of any other crusade where they stopped at any city and resupplied or took a city. Antioch wasn't, as far as I know, was not in the directive of the First Crusade, but where's the criticism of that? Fighting at Dorylaeum was not in the directive of the First Crusade. Taking the city of Nicaea. This is just ridiculous. Where were we? All right. The Pope did expect Richard to delay so long. Well, okay, so Richard's delay also only matters because Frederick Barbarossa and his son died along the way, and his army basically melted away and retreated back to Germany and various other similar areas. Also, Philip Augustus arrived, I believe, several months before Richard, and his impact was negligible. So the only reason why it's a big deal for Richard to get there is because obviously Frederick Barbarossa's huge army doesn't make it, and Philip Augustus, his impact was negligible. On the contrary, Peter of Blois called explicitly for a speedy arrival in the Holy Land. Richard the Warrior enjoyed magnificent successes in his Mediterranean island adventures, but Richard the Crusade leader had seriously strayed from the intent of the crusade. After Richard had taken Cyprus in 1191, he joined King Philip of France, who was already at the siege of Acre. With the English army finally present, Acre fell in a mere 5 weeks, after 2 years of the Crusade army's decimation in trying to recover it. Richard's presence made a significant difference, that is true, with foes as well as with friends. He immediately alienated the German crusaders over the loot and insulted they departed. Now this, it's interesting how Richard gets the blame for insulting others, but others don't get any blame for breaking their crusading vows. Richard said mean words to me, therefore, the crusade is over. Okay. Their revenge would come after the crusade when they captured and held Richard for a king's ransom. Also true, and also Leopold of Austria, the Duke of Austria, who famously captured him and famously left the crusade butthurt, he was excommunicated for capturing Richard. So not only does he get no criticism here for breaking his crusading vows, committing a crime for which he was excommunicated, no, that's Richard's fault for saying some mean words. Philip of France, also having become hostile, he became hostile to Richard, quit the crusade only weeks after Acre fell. If only Richard could have been this successful at removing Saladin's allies. We're just sticking to facts here. Shortly afterward, the Lionheart defeated Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf, occupied Jaffa, then led various assaults into Egyptian territory. He also marched his troops toward Jerusalem in 1191 and again in 1192, but retreated both times. It was the second of these marches that produced the image of Richard using his tunic to shield himself from the sight of Jerusalem. Soon afterward, Richard signed a truce, then departed soon afterwards. That's his treatment of the epic victory at Jaffa. Soon afterwards, Richard signed a truce, then departed from the east in 1192. I love these multiple mentions of Jaffa as, something happened, something happened and, whatever. Sorry, 1 second. Taking Jaffa in September 1191 was the high water mark of Richard's crusade. That wasn't, no. Yeah, okay. So he's referring, his initial taking of Jaffa, he's not referring to the Battle of Jaffa. On one hand, the king was in complete command and Jaffa defended the nearest port which could supply a siege of Jerusalem. On the other hand, as Geoffrey Hindley observed, the Muslims at this point were totally demoralized. For Richard had shown his strength in siege warfare at Acre as well as his ability in the open field at Arsuf. Who or what could withstand the Lionheart? Crusade leaders met to decide the next step. Divisions appeared between Richard, who wanted to rebuild Ascalon, a castle some 30 miles to the south which guarded the road to Egypt, and those which he actually did rebuild it at his own personal expense, and those who wanted to march on Jerusalem, some 40 miles due east. Ambrose wrote that the army insisted instead on Jaffa being rebuilt, because the shortest road doth wend, thence their pilgrimage end. Ambrose's argument referred to the fact that Ascalon was miles in the wrong direction. Occupying Ascalon could be justified as a means to weaken Saladin and to guard supply lines during a siege of Jerusalem. But it was Richard's primary aim to raid Egyptian. territory. I mean, this is ridiculous. Nothing. Okay, so at this point we have to talk about how the crusade worked. because it worked not dissimilarly to the First Crusade. The First Crusade was not run by a single man. Now, in the Third Crusade, obviously, it is directed by a single man with a huge asterisk. In the First Crusade, there was councils, and all of the princes sort of sat on the council and sort of made general group decisions amongst themselves about what they would do next. In this crusade, obviously, because at this point, because Philip had abandoned his crusading vow, broken his crusading vow, let's call it, and then would go on to break his further vow to Richard that he would not attack or subvert his lands back home, and took a significant portion of his army with him. And he left French soldiers there who, for example, the Duke of Burgundy and other French soldiers who had to get loans from Richard because they didn't have the money to go on. Philip just left them there. So because Philip had abandoned, let's say, his third of the crusade, and Frederick Barbarossa died, no, can't prevent that. But that's another huge portion of the army that would have been. The point being is that Richard is extremely undermanned relative to what people thought would have been the army that would have been going to take Jerusalem. So he's down by a huge amount. Now, we have to also understand about which this is all very well explained in the book, which I know the author here has read and just decides to not mention, is that a huge local contingent, because obviously when you're on crusade there, you would expect to be working with the local lords who were there, representing the kingdom of Jerusalem. But the largest local contingent was holed up in Tyre and was not helping him at all. In fact, at certain points, they were depriving the army of shipments of goods, and the army was starving. People were starving to death because of that. Because of Conrad of Montferrat being holed up in Tyre and refusing them supplies. So Richard, these other parts of the army, like the Duke of Burgundy, or I believe it's his nephew, Henry of Champagne, all of these other different lords who are minor lords, but still lords in their own right, or the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights Templar. Yes, Richard can command them all together, but he also has to lead in such a way that keeps the army together. Because if he makes decisions that go against what a particular faction of the army wants to do, then that particular faction of the army may just get up and leave the next day. So he's making it sound like Richard is some sort of absolute monarch who basically just can go like, let's go adventure in Egypt. And then everyone just goes into Egypt. And then he can go, oh, let's go towards Jerusalem. And everybody goes towards Jerusalem. The reality is that he has to manage all of these different coalitions, from the Knights Templar to the French, to the locals, to obviously his English lords or his French lords that he rules over, or contingents of Germans or whoever. He has to negotiate and keep this coalition together. And he's the only one who can do it. And that's a real big problem for him later on, because Guy of Lusignan, who's a relative of his, who he would like to assume power as the local lord, is so unpopular amongst all of the local lords that he's unable to simply just leave him there. So Richard has to manage this giant coalition. In addition, it should be obvious, Richard's first time in the Holy Land. So he doesn't know the lay of the land. It's not like it's one thing for those who are preaching the crusade to just say, yes, go march on Jerusalem. But there's legitimate logistical concerns to marching on Jerusalem, such as making sure that the army has water. So there's certain points where Richard gets near Jerusalem, and then they realize that all of the wells have been poisoned or blocked up. That continuing in that environment is exactly what caused the disaster or enabled the stupendous victory at Hattin. I don't want to say every, because it's not that Richard is beyond criticism, but almost every criticism that comes up in these types of things is a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of thing, where they're just going to criticize him anyway because they just don't like him for whatever reason. So it's these types of things. It's just a very silly way of actually coming up with a criticism that is highly biased, as you can see from the wording and the way that they're talking about things, and purposely obscures decision making. Where once Richard, I believe it was after they took Jaffa, where he's saying then they went on to Ascalon, or then what, and then adventures in Egyptian territory. Well, the Templars and the Hospitallers, who were, if I recall correctly, the strongest local contingent, because Conrad was holed up in Tyre for the entire crusade, they wanted to march on Egypt because they wanted to break Saladin's ability to attack the Holy Land. Who's going to know better than the Templars or the Hospitallers? And apparently just this author, the guy who wrote this paper, knows better. And of course, the French, if I recall correctly, the French contingent of the army, which still made up a sizable contingent of Richard's army, wanted to march directly on Jerusalem. So Richard has these two large factions of his army that are trying to go in opposite directions. He has to manage that, or his army is not going to, and he's already at, let's say theoretically, a third of the strength, or the crusading army is already at 1/3 strength. So it's just a ridiculous, it's just a cherry picking of things and a framing them in such a way that is really just not realistic. Excuse me for 1 second. Apologies if you weren't here at the beginning. I woke up not feeling very well today. I have a sore throat, kind of sick, but I said I would do it. We're going to power through. Here we go. During the restoration of Jaffa, Richard enjoyed a number of adventurous skirmishes in the area. I also appreciate how he's 2,000 miles away from home, with 1/3 the size of an army to complete the task. Factions in the army are fighting with each other, and he's fighting the most competent enemy in the Holy Land that has ever existed against the Crusaders. And they paint Richard as enjoying adventurous skirmishes after they don't, the people have starved to death because they don't have supplies. And then he just implies that, Richard is just enjoying adventurous skirmishes. I mean, it's just very silly. It's just a complete slander, in my opinion. For example, once the king personally went foraging. Well, now hold on. Foraging is not an adventure. It's not just a pleasure trip. Foraging is literally getting food. But too far afield with too small a squad. I mean, he's just that adventurous. Saracens surrounded the group and began to attack. The Lionheart valiantly held off the closing circle of Saracens, but time was running out. From over a hill, one crusader came upon the situation and sized it up. This is William of Preo. He impersonated Richard in order to lead the attackers to himself, thus making it possible for the king to fight free. Like Richard's foray within view of Jerusalem, such incidents provided rich fuel for chivalrous tales, but contributed little toward the goal of the crusade. That's right. You read it here first. Getting food contributes little toward the goal of the crusade. This is an academic paper. The king risked himself often in such encounters, and in doing so risked the entire crusade. Ambrose brought out precisely this point in a long passage which cautioned against such bravado, saying that a number of worthy men insisted that the king cease these personal combats because his death might well mean their own. That is true. Richard ignored the advice. I don't know about that. Pushing Saladin into retreat the following November, Richard moved the army east to Ramla, about half the distance to Jerusalem. There the army remained, neither advancing nor retreating in the winter rains, merely getting itself and its supplies soaked. As the interregnum Regis Ricardi put it, for 6 weeks we were really not in pleasurable times, but a good end would have made up for the hard beginning. As if you haven't known already what that good end is, the good end, completing the crusade in Jerusalem, had become a distinct possibility. During November and December, Saladin had to disband his fatigued troops, keeping only a tentative hold on Jerusalem. As Hindley has indicated, Saladin's small winter army could not hope to match Richard in the field. The Crusade army moved to Beit Nuba, 12 miles from Jerusalem. The weather worsened. The rains rusted armor and the winds tore tent stakes out of the ground. Still, the itinerarium, Regis Ricardi recorded the one hope which sustained the troops, that neither enemy nor obstacle would stop them from consummating the crusade. It's also important to note here that the average crusader, of course, is there to take the city of Jerusalem, and that is their goal. I'm talking about just the average soldier, the average crusader. The average crusader does not have to deal with the responsibility necessarily of logistics. Like when the army wakes up in the morning, the average crusader who's just there in their tent is not thinking, wow, I hope we camp by water tonight, or what can I do to make sure that we camp by water tonight, or that the army has enough water, or that we have food. Ultimately, those are Richard's concerns, which is why he has to concern himself with them, which is why he's out foraging. So, of course, the average soldier is going to be sustained by the hope of capturing Jerusalem. That's how these things work. This is like such a I feel like I have to explain basic human psychology and like basic army logistics to a 14-year-old Redditor in reading this paper. It's so bad. But this is an academic paper written by a grown man who has allegedly read the primary source and somehow doesn't understand how army logistics work. But, and this is what passes as history, and it's just slander. It's nonsense. However, the Templars, Hospitallers, and some local barons argued against a siege because of Saladin's threat to their supply lines and because of the fear that there would not be enough troops to garrison Jerusalem once it was captured. Important to note here, the local barons are arguing against what is supposed to happen here. Instead, they insisted that Richard continue his adventures and border skirmishing. They didn't argue. In my reading of it, they never argued for a continuance of adventures, nor skirmishing. They argued for either breaking Saladin's power, crushing Saladin's army, or taking cities that would allow the Kingdom of Jerusalem to consolidate power and then make a concerted strike to take Jerusalem. I don't recall the Templars or the Hospitallers arguing against the capture of Jerusalem, which they may have said, they may have been concerned that there wouldn't be enough troops. And certainly, by the way, that was a legitimate concern the first time. And this is why it feels like having to explain this to just like a child, because part of the reason the First Crusade was successful was because the Muslim world around the crusading states at the time was fractured. And they were fighting each other, so they were unable to mount a unified response. If the Third Crusade, let's just say, in carbon copy of the First Crusade, simply just marched in, it's not that simple, but let's just say marched in, took Jerusalem, and then, exactly the same as the First Crusade, 90 to 95% of everybody just leaves, then Saladin can just siege the city of Jerusalem with its 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 defenders, and his army of probably at that point 50,000 or 70,000 is what he would be able to put into the field, and surround the entire city and probably likely successfully take it. What is the point? It's a legitimate concern that they need to make plans for what happens after the fact. Philip already took a huge portion of his army with him. Barbarossa didn't make it with his massive army. So Richard is left to make these decisions with a force that is a fraction of the size. And these are legitimate concerns that should be debated or analyzed, but this method of doing it, where it's just like, he just didn't march on Jerusalem and take it like an idiot. It's cartoonish. It's clownish. It doesn't even represent any realistic concerns. He's mentioning that even the locals who are the most familiar with warfare are advising against it or advising caution. And yet, this guy knows better. Instead, they insist that Richard continue his adventures in border skirmishing. The method they proposed was that the army should not consummate the crusade, non consumaratur peregrinatio. Such advice coming from an ordinary crusader would have been seen as treasonous to the cause. From those warlords, it was astonishing, rather like marriage without consummation. It contradicted the intent of the deed. Richard followed the advice of avoiding Jerusalem, which fell right in with his pattern of activity. Having wasted the army's supplies during the past month of winter campaigning near Jerusalem, he ordered... Okay. It's also worth noting at this time, Richard is getting an increasing volume of messages from back home at this time now, when he's, trying to strike towards Jerusalem or like marching the army there and then not and whatever. Ambrose mentions that he's getting letters back home about how Philip is starting to work with John against him. They're working against his counselors. They're trying to take his kingdom. He's getting these letters that say, if you stay there any longer, you're not going to have a kingdom when you come home. He wants to go back home. It says in there he's trying to go back home. He wants to go back home, but now he's torn between being stuck in this place with a small army. His lands and his interests are being subverted back home. But he's come all the ways, 98% of the distance toward fulfilling the goal, even if it's a huge obstacle still in front of him. And he wants to complete it. I think it's pretty clear that he wants to make sure that the factions stay together and that they complete their task. But there's obviously logistical problems. The army is so small, their supply lines are very fragile. The inland march over the desert is very difficult. The wells have been blocked up and poisoned. But he needs to get back home, and he wants to get back home. It talks about in there multiple times how he's very stressed out about the situation back home because he's getting these increasing volume of letters back home saying that his lands and his interests are in jeopardy. So this coloring of him, he followed the advice of avoiding Jerusalem, which fell right in with his pattern of activity. That's just not how the primary source reads. It's not. It's cartoonishly false framing. Having wasted the army supplies during the past month of winter campaigning near Jerusalem, he's just wasting them. He ordered a full retreat and a future advance on Ascalon. By failing to march the last few miles to Jerusalem, he turned his back on the goal set by Pope Gregory VIII. Furthermore, by remaining longer in the Holy Land, he violated two criteria of just war theory. He was admitting that he had no reasonable prospect of success of achieving the goal, which is why he marched back to Jerusalem again. And yet he persisted in carrying on wanton violence against people and property in the area. No, he was working with the Hospitallers and the Templars and trying to keep the French coalition there and keep them from leaving and trying to build up these other cities like Ascalon, which he was personally paying to fortify. This is so ridiculous. Again, I would encourage everybody to just read the primary source for yourself, because if you just read this, which you can see in the the footnotes here. I mean, he's sourcing, he's putting Ambrose in the footnotes constantly. Perhaps the Templars and other warlords wanted to keep the army intact, as Hans Mayer has suggested. Yes, they did want to keep the army intact because that way they could fight Saladin if he attacked them, and they would be able to take another city if that seemed logistically an option. Ascalon was once part of the Latin kingdom. Pope Gregory did target the Holy City and its environs. Still, this secondary goal of conquering territory needed to give way to the primary goal of recovering Jerusalem. Yes, do you understand how supply lines work? At some point, if not at all points. The warlords' decision to keep the warlords. He's calling them warlords now. Do you think you ever call Saladin a warlord? The warlords' decision to keep the crusade away from Jerusalem was also contradictory to the intent of individual crusaders. Yes, when they heard of the retreat, great grief overcame them. Yes, because their concern is marching to Jerusalem and fulfilling their vow. Their concern is not what happens 5 seconds after the crusade. Their concern isn't how are you going to pay for this. Their concern is not what cities are going to hold this. Their concern is not supply lines. So yes, obviously. Perhaps the Templars and other warlords wanted to keep the army intact, as Hans Mayer has suggested, in order to gain more land for the Latin kingdom and thus provide aid to its inhabitants. Yes, obviously. Ascalon was once part... Oh, wait. Sorry. I read that already. The decision to retreat disappointed the whole army, not just the French or the non-locals. Both Ambrose and the Itinerarium Regis Riccardi, sources that generally make Richard into a hero, as he is rightly, deservedly made, concluded this segment with a reprimand that if the Crusaders had only known the weak condition of Saladin and his defenses, they could have taken the city with very little effort. Maybe. This is such a, of course, wow, if only Richard didn't. The man is literally being subverted from every angle here, okay? The biggest contingent of locals have holed up in Tyre and are refusing to support him. He's getting word that back home his brother and the oath-breaking, crusading, vow-breaking Philip of Augustus not only are not working with him here, but are working against his interests back home, dividing his attention. And he's supposed to somehow exactly deduce the situation. I mean, this is so ridiculous. Internal strife soon reappeared. Richard reunited the French, English, and other components of the army in Ascalon to rebuild the fortress, but then he ceased to support the French. Even when they begged for a loan, Richard denied them. Yet at that time, he was collecting a great deal of produce from the locals, and Saladin himself had sent him 24,000 dinars that winter in ransom payments. As Peter Edbury and Christopher Tyerman have noted, Richard's war chest was in excellent shape. Was Richard trying to save funds, or was he acting out one more chivalrous duel with the French? Yes, this is, you like how they paint this negatively and then say, this is chivalry. The answer emerged when Richard required the leading French noble, the Duke of Burgundy, to repay a large loan immediately, which he had given him previously. The Duke was furious and withdrew to Acre. Richard then sent orders to refuse admittance of all French into Acre. While the Duke certainly contributed to this friction, take note, and note who doesn't contribute to this friction is Philip Augustus, who should have been there paying for his Duke to be on crusade. Okay, King Richard should have been above it, or at least he should not have been instigating it, as he had done previously when he alienated the German crusaders. Yes, he alienated them, but they don't get any, again, they can just leave the crusade and they don't get any criticism for that. You can do crimes that you get excommunicated for, and that doesn't get you any, that's no criticism. But if you say mean words, if you're just a little bit angry at somebody, well, you're a bad man. Saladin expected Richard to be on the attack and summoned Muslim commanders and troops to regroup by the month of May. which was the prime campaigning season. Richard disappointed this expectation. He had received news about a rebellion in his kingdom involving King Philip and Prince John. In order to protect his European holdings, he decided to abandon the crusade. Again, the language here, right? When Richard decides to leave, he's abandoning. And what was the language when Philip left? What language did he use when Philip left? I believe it was right here. Oh. Yeah, here we go. Oh, wait. No, should have been here. What's the language that he used when Philip leaves? Yes, remember when the Germans are insulted, they, quote, departed. Yes, and Philip of France, also having becoming hostile to Richard, he quit the crusade, only weeks. But when Richard leaves, he abandons the crusade. So let's see. Yep, he decided to abandon the crusade. He doesn't leave the crusade. He doesn't decide to leave. He doesn't decide to quit. He decides to abandon the crusade. However, soon the news about the revolt became mixed, sometimes reporting threats to the king's position, sometimes reporting that problems were solved. Given this reprieve, Richard moved the army even further away from Jerusalem. In mid-May, he besieged the fortress of Darin, which was on the main route to Egypt, about 20 miles south of Ascalon, if I recall, at the Templars and Hospitallers' urging. Not waiting for the troops led by Henry of Champagne and the Duke of Burgundy, Richard began the siege. A number of problems faced the Crusaders at Darin, one of which was not having enough troops to encircle the large fortification. Furthermore, Darin had 17 powerful towers, a wide moat, large stone outcroppings, which contributed to the castle's defenses. Richard's stonecasters and sappers went to work and within only a couple days breached the walls. Inside they found loot, supplies, and 40 Christian prisoners. Richard's group proved very effective at siegecraft. A week later, the Crusade army captured 2 large caravans. They seized about 1,000 sheep from one. The army was prepared and fit, and its royal commander showed he was very capable of acting without delay. True. Let me take a drink here. During the final week of May 1192, Richard left the army which was rebuilding Darin. He carried on more of his famous exploits outside of Ascalon. At this point, the contrast between Richard and the Crusaders could not be more plain. Richard continued his chivalrous adventures. The troops finished the work at Darin, then planned a march on Jerusalem. As the Interrerum Regis Ricardi has it, in Richard's absence, the various dukes, counts, and other leaders, French, Norman, English, Picts, and others, unanimously chose the march. Stressing the absence of the king and the concord of all others, the one voice of the army and leaders, rich and poor alike, set out for Jerusalem, even if the king resisted. Along the way, the Crusaders were harassed by stinging flies, the only enemy they would meet on this march outside of the Lionheart. Just reporting the facts here that the only enemy the crusading army encounters at this point is Richard the Lionheart himself and some stinging flies, but mostly Richard. They passed the test of the flies. All hoped to make it to Jerusalem, except, as the Interrerum Regis Ricardi noted, King Richard. It took a Poitevin sermon to change Richard's mind. As Ambrose recorded it, the sermon hit him where it hurt. Sire, they speak of you in blame. Richard vowed to stay on the crusade until the following Easter. As it turned out, he left earlier than that, breaking even this crusade vow. Keep in mind, at this point, Philip has broken 2 vows, and not once has been mentioned to have broken a crusading vow. But Richard, not even having arrived at the point where he's going to break the vow, is already noted as having broken a crusading vow. Just reporting the facts here, just unbiased facts. In June of 1192, the army marched back to Beit Nuba and regained the camp of the previous winter, 12 miles from Jerusalem, without hindrance. The march took only 5 days. Ambrose dwelled on the unity within the army and the overall esprit de corps, as nobles lent horses to those in need and themselves walked behind their own mounts. Then occurred Richard's chase, which brought him before the walls of Jerusalem. Why was he not getting down to the business of a siege, especially considering the lack of Muslim resistance? The immediate reason, or stall tactic, was that as soon as Richard had reached Beit Nuba, he sent Henry of Champagne back to Acre to gather a few recalcitrant troops. As Ambrose put it, during a whole month's time or more, we had to stay in that same place. Since each crusader carried 1 month's supplies, these weeks were crucial. What Richard had accomplished in sending Henry away was to divide the previously united leadership, spend valuable supplies on nothing, take some of the motivation out of a very inspired army, and to the degree that Henry was successful at bringing back deserters, that much would he dilute the army's unified spirit. At this point, it's worth noting that he even mentions, this guy says that Richard is very competent. He even just mentions the siege of Darren, which he takes in just a few days, he didn't even wait. It seemed possible. So Richard is an expert, I think it's fair to say, at taking castles, at taking cities and fortified positions. It was his arrival at Acre that proved decisive. He did it again at Darren. If that was possible, you don't think Richard would have done it? This argument is basically just mind reading that he was capable. He was here. He wanted to go back home. His army was in a very fragile state that he was keeping together, and he was within striking distance, and he just wanted to goof around. If you read in Ambrose, it talks about a big concern is water. All of the water around the area, they thought, was poisoned, or the wells were all blocked up. I'm not exactly sure how a Redditor takes a city without water. It seems like it's impossible for a medieval army to do that, but maybe there's some way to do that they didn't know about. I don't know. Anyway. Only upon Henry's return would he even debate the move. Meanwhile, Saladin had to deal with an exhausted Muslim army and grumbling allies, who publicly argued against continuing the war, all of which weakened his position in Jerusalem. The Third Crusade could not have had an enemy more devastating than the foot-dragging Lionheart. It's just like in Batman. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. During this inactivity, remnants of the True Cross were presented to the army by local Christians. The cross itself had been captured by Saladin in 1187, and its importance to the crusade had often been underestimated by modern historians. For example, William Stubbs surprised himself when, on comparing the various chronicles concerning the Battle of Hattin, he found that the loss of Jerusalem seemed to have been less shock generally than the capture of the True Cross. Whether or not we attach such importance to the cross, the Crusaders certainly did. That's true. The presence of these pieces of the True Cross greatly energized the camp. The Crusaders and some of the leaders demanded a march to Jerusalem. Richard, the military orders, and some of the local nobles countered the move again because they had said of vulnerable supply lines, because most of the wells around Jerusalem had been blocked up or poisoned, and because the difficulty of not having enough troops to encircle the city or to hold it once it was taken. All of those are reasonable. I don't know what is the problem here. Richard can risk a risky siege against a city on the coast where he can be relieved by boats or escape by boats. If you risk a siege, however many miles it is, 20 miles, 30 miles, I forget, inland Jerusalem, and you run out of water with an army of tens of thousands of men, you are dead. That is just not a mistake that you can goof around with. Whereas, of course, he can be a lot more adventurous, if you will, not in the slanderous tone that they mean, but you can be more aggressive in an area where you can be resupplied, or you have ability, your supply lines are not constrained. 30 miles inland, surrounded by blocked up or poisoned wells, is not a condition that you can goof around with. I don't know what is difficult to understand about this. If King Richard's intent was to keep the army safe, then it disagreed with the army's goal of securing Jerusalem. The final decision was skewed by Richard, who insisted that 20 representatives chosen by him should vote on the issue. Only 5 voters represented the army and the French leaders. Of the others, 5 were Templars, 5 Hospitallers, and 5 were locals who supported the king. Of course, because all the locals who didn't were holed up entire, not doing anything for the entire time. If you don't know this stuff and you read this, then you think, oh, Richard is just picking guys who are going to vote with him. All of the guys who would potentially vote against him are like 100 miles away, of their own choosing. Not surprisingly, they chose Egypt as the target. Gerrymandering is an old art. Just reporting the facts here. Still, the French refused to abide by this decision and insisted on marching to Jerusalem. Richard would not lead them, but to save face. He offered to become a soldier in their army, knowing full well that the French nobles could not effectively command the large English contingent, especially with this English king in its ranks. If that was just a bluff, then they should have called his bluff. I don't believe it was a bluff. I believe he didn't want the responsibility of leading the army into what was almost certainly suicide. But what do I know? I'm not an academic. The people criticized and cursed, but began the retreat on account of Richard's opposition. Saladin had his greatest ally in the Lionheart. At this time, the Crusaders captured a large caravan from Egypt, defeating both the Egyptian army of about 2,000 guarding it and 500 picked relief troops sent by Saladin from Jerusalem. Now the city's defense was desperate because Saladin had lost so many choice troops and supplies, and because the Crusade army now had an ample amount of supplies, adding not only a great deal of food, gold, and spices, but also thousands of horses and camels. The army began once more to make lament, for there was great desire in them to lay siege to Jerusalem. Of course, they all came that far to do that. Once again, Richard reiterated the reasons for opposing the siege: water scarcity, lack of manpower, and vulnerable supply lines. He forced the Crusaders to retreat all the way into the Mediterranean. After more skirmishing along the coast, that's the Battle of Jaffa, for those of you who didn't catch the beginning. After more skirmishing along the coast, King Richard signed a truce and soon departed for Europe. What really was the Muslim situation? But there's no way for Richard to know that. You have to remember, his army is there's spies in his army that are reporting back to Saladin, not the other way around. He doesn't have spies in Saladin's army. His army is reliant on local trading and stuff to be supplied, so spies can come in and out. Crusaders and anyone who's loyal to Richard, unless you can find locals who will do that, which is very difficult to find and do, he didn't have very good intel on Saladin's positions and his exact strength and all that stuff. Sorry, excuse me 1 second, I have to cough here. Oh. Sorry, excuse me. If you didn't hear, I'm a little under the weather today, but we're doing it live anyway. So doing my best here. Throughout the period of Richard's crusade, Saladin wrestled with dissension in his ranks as well as outright revolts. Muslim troops had been in the field a long time. During that crucial month of May, 1192, Saladin's eldest son withdrew his services until the Sultan could smooth over dissensions in the Muslim court. Worse than this, Saladin's nephew and battle commander, Taqi al-Din Umar, deserted Jerusalem and began his own conquests north of Baghdad. Well, he sounds like an adventurer. In an interesting speculation, Lyons and Jackson argued that if Richard had besieged Jerusalem, Saladin's position was so weak that the Sultan would have had to leave the city. With the coast and the Egyptian road in Crusader hands, Saladin could find the Hattin position reversed and his own army cut off without supplies. This is all true, but this is all crazy speculation after the fact. There's no way for Richard to know this, and after he's already got a small force and an army that is extremely divided and barely able to hold together and can't agree on anything and is being subverted back home, he doesn't have sort of the unified force to be able to make that push inland. So, of course, it's easy to quarterback this after the fact. While Richard had kept up unusually close communications with the Muslim camp, it is uncertain how much he knew of such weakness in his enemy, obviously. What he surely must have recognized, as Aaron Kreutz put it, was the shocking failure of Muslim resistance during 1191-1192. Every time Richard put the Crusaders into action, whether siege, march, skirmish, or open battle, the Muslims lost or retreated. But they also were shadowing the army and harassing the army. And the skirmishes, it's also worth noting, the skirmishes that are at least recorded always went in their favor when Richard was involved, because he personally was just slaying people left and right. But there were skirmishes that were successful, that killed Crusaders and that did harm the army. And Saladin's forces did shadow them and cause constant problems, fighting something of a guerrilla warfare. So this idea that that in the moment you would take from that oh, they haven't fought us again, is somehow without better intelligence. I don't know how exactly you'd pick up on that. The Sultan also found his leading emirs frightened and ready to run both times the Crusaders had camped at Beit Nuba. As Hamilton Gibb wrote, Saracen troops were turning to mutiny. The emirs insisted that Saladin leave the city and command an army outside, as had happened at Acre. Keep in mind, if Saladin had done that and Richard had just went on to siege the city and there was a difficult water situation, and now you're sieging the city with no water and there's an army right outside. The Muslim historian Bayhadin, who with Saladin in Jerusalem, wrote that these emirs were simply trying to save their own skins, for with Saladin out of the city, they were free to flee. The previous situation at Acre is exactly what the Saracens expected again. That is, they knew that a crusader leader so close to Jerusalem should bring his enemy even to a difficult siege. Furthermore, Saladin understood that it was his personal leadership alone that kept his army united. Same with Richard. As Saladin himself said, as soon as I am gone, the Muslims will be destroyed. And Bayhadin lamented, these were his words, and it happened just as he said. A few months after the Crusaders had departed, Saladin died on the 4th of March, 1193. The Muslim political world fragmented. If Richard had stayed until Easter, as he had vowed, he could have strolled into Jerusalem. He could have just strolled into Jerusalem. Such a victory might have well preempted the tragic Fourth Crusade. So now we'll blame Richard for the Fourth Crusade. As it turned out, one crusade after another shattered the peace in the generation after 1192 because Richard continued to bury his head under his tunic. The point is not that Richard could have taken Jerusalem. Crusaders then and modern historians like Kate Norgate have noted this. Read that again. The point is not that he could have taken Jerusalem, because it's likely that he couldn't, but rather that any good crusade leader should have done what the army expected. Any good crusade leader should have done what the army expected. That's not... Again, I addressed this at the beginning. And what Saladin expected: make the attempt to enter the city. Okay, so getting within sight of the city was not making an attempt. He traveled 2,000 miles. That doesn't count as making an attempt. The entire premise of the Third Crusade, to secure the holy places, had been stated consistently by those who called the crusade. However, Richard had taken a large army that had once decided unanimously to fulfill that goal, and he had divided it, delayed it, opposed it, and finally pried it out of the east. This is just like a slanderous or dishonest reading of the primary source. He didn't do those things. That's just not true. Diverting it not once, but twice from the goal. Richard's decisions extended crusade warfare, not only for the added time he remained in the Holy Land, but his lack of results forced. We're blaming him for future crusades. Remember, we're not blaming Philip Augustus for leaving the crusade and causing any of this. We don't blame Philip Augustus for leaving and breaking his vows. We don't blame John for working with Philip to subvert his kingdom back home and force Richard to try to hurry back home. We don't blame any of them. No, we blame Richard. His lack of results forced a number of other crusades into the field. In other words, a dedicated siege of Jerusalem would probably have won the city. Except you just said the point was not that he could have taken Jerusalem, because he probably couldn't have. And ended the war then and there, particularly when assuming Saladin's death before next campaign season, which actually did occur. Decisive action might well have resulted in, as Peter de Blois had written, peace in the land for some time to come. This would have made unnecessary the crusades of the next decades, that is, Emperor Henry IV's crusade, which was fatal to him, the Fourth Crusade, which was fatal to Byzantium, and the Fifth Crusade, which was fatal to the inhabitants of Damietta, as well as a great many crusaders. So we can just blame Richard for all those too. And again, we're going to be wrapping up. I think we're coming to the end, almost the end here. If you want to make any comments, you can catch the stream on YouTube or just respond to that top post on my X timeline that has the Office Michael Scott meme about the stream. Just respond there and make a comment there if you have anything that you want me to talk about, and we'll go over those at the end of the stream. Cartesian Doubt says a great crusader. The man trounced Saladin in 3 separate battles. Indeed, he did. After the second retreat from Jerusalem, it had become clear to contemporaries that Richard was a failure as a crusader leader. The French took to singing insulting songs about him, to which the king replied in kind. Beyond national rivalries, a more subtle criticism of the crusade emerged as Ambrose, the king's own poet, held the crusading models of Charlemagne, who beat the Saxons, and Roland, who followed his obligation to his dying breath. Concerning the third crusader's intent to begin the siege, Ambrose took Roland's message to heart. They asked no more to live, indeed, if once Jerusalem were free. Okay, so the criticism here is that Richard didn't put the army in a suicidal position. He didn't drive his army to the point of suicide, is the criticism here. In what is a striking and revealing censure, Ambrose and the English author of the Iterarium Regis Riccardi applied the first crusade as a normative model to Richard's crusade. Both cited the siege of Antioch, where the crusaders had little hope of success, and had even less after they won the city, since a large Muslim relief force in turn besieged them. Yet Godfrey and the others won because they continued to try. Unlike Richard, just didn't try. We're just reporting the facts here. When the first crusaders faced various difficulties, holy relics like the lance activated them. That is true. The third crusade found pieces of the true cross, which did motivate the army. Also true, but without results because of the king's resistance. It's worth noting that the siege of Antioch, for example, they thought they were going to be resupplied by Alexios, which Alexios was marching to the relief of them at Antioch. And then they realized they were going to get stuck by an incoming army. The incoming army would obviously be much faster and would overtake them. And it seemed like perhaps maybe they could break the siege. It was unknown, but Bohemond was sort of leading them on. The relief efforts never came because Stephen of Blois abandoned the army and met Alexios on the way and told him, don't worry about it, everybody's dead. So Alexios turned around. And at that point, they just had no other option. You have to remember, Richard has responsibilities and he has options, and he has to provide for supply lines. He has a kingdom back home. He has to work these things out, and he's there by himself with a smaller force. It's just... When Raymond and Godfrey found that the First Crusade had become bogged down in Antioch, they were able to move a portion of the troops forward without wasting time looking for deserters. That's just not true. My understanding of it is that Raymond wanted to argue with Bohemond about control of the city until a huge portion of the army was seemingly on the border of revolt, on the edge of revolt, at which point they were like, well, we better keep moving. And then they moved on. So it wasn't because they were like, we're going to be quick. Unlike Richard, Raymond actually was stalling and dragging his feet because he wanted to dispute the claim of the city. These crusaders had options other than a march on Jerusalem. For example, Baldwin's group remained in Edessa, Bohemond's group stayed in Antioch, and some, like Stephen of Blois, simply went home. He just simply goes home. He doesn't abandon a crusade like Richard does. He just simply goes home. He doesn't break his vow like Richard does. He just simply goes home. When Godfrey and his group besieged Jerusalem, they, like the Third Crusaders, found the wells blocked up. That they lacked manpower to encircle the city, their supply lines alternated between vulnerable and non-existent, and the large Muslim relief force was on the way. Again, a big difference between the First and the Third Crusade is that they didn't have a unified Muslim force opposing them a couple miles away. That was the largest and most competent Muslim relief army under Saladin that any of the Crusaders had fought. So I understand that comparison, but it's not really a fair comparison. In large part, a lot of people will say, a lot of historians will say, the First Crusade was successful because of the fractured nature of the surrounding Muslim territories and their own infighting. That was not the case in the Third Crusade. But according to this guy, the Muslim relieving force did arrive after part of the First Crusade had departed. See, it arrived after a part of the First Crusade, like 95% of the First Crusade departed. And that's of what remained after, they probably took 70% casualties or something. A very small force remained. And the only reason that they beat that, or I should say the reason they beat that army, is because the army basically was so huge relative to the small crusading force. They just figured they're not going to do anything. And they woke up one morning to the 1,000 men basically running through their camp, and they routed the army and, slaughtered a few thousand people, a few thousand of the Muslim soldiers, basically driving the army out. They caught them by just arrogantly in complete surprise. It wasn't because they had the forces to go toe-to-toe with the Muslim army. In fact, the Muslim army saw them and thought they were so insignificant that they arrogantly just left themselves open to attack. And Godfrey and his forces realized that it was probably their opportunity to strike. And even afterward, there were enough men to garrison Jerusalem, again, because there's not a Muslim army of 50,000 outside, and keep it politically stable. These events were well known to the Third Crusaders. As the Interarium Regis Riccardi put it, Godfrey and the First Crusaders gained victory because, quoting the biblical book of wisdom, they were worthy to receive the wages they worked for. The application to Richard needs no explanation. In Richard of Devise's history of the Third Crusade, it is only through falsehoods that he made the Lionheart look like a good crusader for his English audience. According to Devise's counterfactual history, Richard the Lionheart was held back from besieging Jerusalem by none other than the French. It was the bishops and the king's household who signed a most hateful and unwanted truce which kept Richard from the goal of Jerusalem. Conrad was negotiating separately with Saladin. A truce which was signed while the king lay sick in bed and unaware. This must have been after Jaffa. It's either at Acre, during the siege of Acre, or after Jaffa is when he was sick in bed. This sort of myth-making undeniably supports the legend of Richard's crusade as portrayed in Walter Scott's Talisman, but the genuine history of Richard's crusade leadership tells a very different story. Indeed, it does, if you would only read the primary source. Were Richard's decisions to retreat from Jerusalem a gem of military wisdom because of the problems before him? Was a cautious policy, especially in light of Hattin, the best policy for defending the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem? Perhaps so. Many modern historians have accepted this premise. Part of the current thinking behind favoring this cautious policy seems to be an understandable affection for peace, or at least the idea that limited warfare is less harmful than an all-out move to take and hold Jerusalem. However, the Third Crusade was not called for defense. There was precious little left to defend. According to the Crusade propagandists, the majority of those who participated under Richard, the prime object of the Third Crusade was to secure Jerusalem, not to restore a rump kingdom. That's true. Furthermore, the long and desperate siege of Acre illustrates that crusading participants before Richard's arrival were anything but cautious. For example, the Templar Grand Master Gerard de Riedfort had favored the vigorous and disastrous policy at Hattin. It's worth noting here how he is saying that, was Richard's policy good? Perhaps so, but there were other people who disagreed with him. All of the people who participated in the absolute disaster of Hattin, all of the people who did stupid stuff, disagreed with Richard and agreed with me, the author of this paper. What kind of argument is this? Perhaps he should have known better, but later he actively committed himself and his troops to the siege of Acre under King Guy of Lusignan. In one battle, Gerard faced Taqi al-Din, Saladin's nephew who later deserted and so hurt the Sultan's strength. Taqi al-Din disrupted the Templar line, resulting in Gerard's capture and execution. The telling example of Guy of Lusignan reveals that Hattin did not instill a cautious policy in him either, even after Gerard's death. So in order to support his thesis for the paper here, he's using perhaps the two biggest bungling fools of the entire period, their disastrous logic, which led to their own deaths, and somehow Richard is supposed to emulate that. How does this make any sense? Along with Reginald of Chatillon, who became noted for his very active policy against Saladin, right in front of the captured and bound Guy of Lusignan, Saladin himself executed Reginald. The Sultan later released Guy, but only after Guy solemnly vowed to stop fighting. If anyone should have been persuaded to a cautious policy, King Guy was the candidate. However, after Saladin released him, Guy began and continued the very risky siege of Acre to its successful conclusion. Do you really want to be on the side of Guy of Lusignan, like the most unpopular man of the entire era? The most hated man of the entire era, the biggest bungler, the man responsible for Hattin? You're going to use him as your justification for why Richard is a bad commander? This is like beyond parody. The historical aftermath of this crusade shows that caution led to more and more widespread crusade violence. There you go. Let me fix this sentence for you. The historical aftermath of this crusade shows that not being suicidal led to more and widespread crusade violence. Peace might have been attained with the retaking of Jerusalem, but the reality, why does Philip Augustus get no blame here? But the reality was that without control of Jerusalem, More wars followed in quick succession in the name of retaking the holy city. Richard not only failed to attempt to take the city, but in his constant military ventures away from Jerusalem, he repudiated the premise of the crusade. Therefore, one conclusion presents itself. As a crusade leader, Richard was a dismal failure. The only mitigation that presents itself results from his secondary successes at Acre, Jaffa, and Cyprus. Yes. Secondary successes. That's how he describes Jaffa. Modern historians may find favor with the cautious policy. Modern historians who have looked at it may disagree with me. But the interests of peace were not served by it in this instance. The papal conception of Richard's leadership supports this conclusion. Pope Celestine's letter of criticism of the Third Crusade, inserted into Howden's English Chronicle, makes this clear. The Pope noted that the Crusaders were unable to effect much because, while some remained faithful to the crusade, others did not follow prescribed crusade activity. Could he have been talking about Philip Augustus? Instead, they made their own arrogant decisions and did other things. What exactly was prescribed crusade activity for Celestine? Besides the usual exhortation to personal religious ideals, the Pope specified the goal of the crusade then, as well as in the future, as liberating and cleansing the holy city and sepulchre. It should be reiterated that the evidence here cited is not drawn from hostile witnesses, such as French songs or chronicles which criticized an English king. Ambrose, Howden, Celestine, and the Interarium Regis Ricardi were sources generally friendly to the King of England. Ambrose didn't really criticize him, at least that was not my reading of it. However, Howden, as Brundage has noted, was a disenchanted friend, disillusioned by a king who had promised so much and delivered so little. Howden had company. That's right, Guy of Lusignan and me, the foolish author of this paper. Modern historians have interpreted Richard's decisions against besieging Jerusalem as remarkably cool judgment. Explaining that if he had begun the siege, the army would have been trapped between the city's garrison and a relief force outside the city. Faced with the realities of the situation, the king made the inevitable decision to retreat. The argument presented in this paper may seem opposed to the humanitarian impulses of these historians. The argument presented in this paper may seem opposed to the non-suicidal impulses of these historians who portray Richard as caring so much about the army's safety that he sacrificed an attempt on Jerusalem. However, the line of thought pursued here does not endorse a crusading enthusiasm, which would have increasingly bloodied the face of civilized life. Actually, the opposite is true. The well-defined goal of the Third Crusade, recovering Jerusalem, and the persistence to pursue it, and only it, would have reduced Richard's widespread warfare and have resulted in the hoped-for peace. Following that goal would also have limited crusade action to Jerusalem and its environs. Instead, crusaders attacked political enemies on Sicily, overturned Byzantium rule on Cyprus, and violated Egyptian. That's Saladin's holdings. That's their enemy. It's important to note that Richard's failure to occupy Jerusalem is pivotal in the subsequent fracturing of the Crusade movement, as the following generation saw the emergence of the political crusades in Sicily, the Fourth Crusade against Byzantium, and the Fifth Crusade against Egypt, entire operations for which Richard had set clear precedents. Also, Joinville cited Richard twice as a model crusader, trying to keep enthusiasm alive during and after St. Louis' Crusade, which were aimed at Egypt. After Louis, the entire crusade movement withered. There is not enough evidence here to conclude that Richard's actions directly caused either There is not enough evidence here to conclude that Richard's actions directly caused either these divergent crusades or the ultimate withering of the crusade movement. That's what you just spent the last paragraph saying. But had Richard succeeded in securing Jerusalem, instead of setting precedents for crusade warfare away from the city, then many of the reasons to pursue these later crusades would not have existed. The implication here is that Richard Lionheart, as a bad crusader who avoided the main goal of the Third Crusade, prolonged and increased warfare. Richard transgressed the limits of the crusade, which were articulated in his day, and he should be judged accordingly. He was no hero, but a man who merely wanted to fight hand-to-hand forever. He was a man who merely wanted to fight hand-to-hand forever. This is an academic paper. We're just reporting the facts. Upon return to his own kingdom. Why would he return to his own kingdom if he just wanted to fight hand-to-hand forever? He continued such skirmishes, which resulted in his death in 1199. Yet from his day to our own, writers and legends have lionized him. Last two paragraphs here. Why? It seems that lionizing tells us much more about those writers and their audiences than about Richard. It is also worth underlining the obvious in this inquiry. While crusade goals and propaganda should have restricted Richard's warfare to the retaking of Jerusalem, they failed to control or direct the army. The religious authority may have been competent to start the crusade and define the goals of hostilities, but it could not enforce them. Pope Celestine could only criticize after the fact, as did Gerald of Wales, who ended his account of preaching the crusade by describing the crusaders at the siege of Acre as in despair because they had been deserted by their leaders and were worn out by wanting so long for supplies, while Richard remained in Sicily. A few years after Richard's misuse of crusade forces, the Byzantine Empire would feel the full weight of such misdirection during the Fourth Crusade. Pope Innocent III had called the Fourth Crusade to recover Jerusalem, and however powerful historians portray this pontiff, he tried but failed to steer the crusade to the Holy Land once its leaders chose other targets, in line with the earlier example of Richard's crusade leadership. We can see just how little control the church actually had over crusade activity when the secular leadership deviated from set goals. Whatever conclusion one may come to concerning the morality of the crusades, it is necessary to distinguish between the limited goals set by the church and the actual hostilities carried on by secular leaders. It is ironic that the brave Lionheart hid under his tunic rather than approach Jerusalem and finish the crusade. If he had occupied the city, that courageous act might well have resulted in the hoped-for peace. In a final twist, if the Templars and other warlords of 1191 could go against the grain by arguing against consummating the crusade, then historians today can study peace as a legitimate issue, even in full-blown crusade ideology, without hiding behind the tunic of cautious, limited policies. So there you have it. The absolute terrible, slanderous, poop academic paper written by Michael Markowski, posted on medievalists.net. The medievalists need to take this down. I'm once again reiterating my challenge to the medievalists to take this off of your website, because it is foolish, cartoonish, and slanderous. It is not only bad history. I mean, I guess I'm not an academic, so I don't know what what exactly qualifies as academics, but even just reading through one of the primary sources myself, I can tell you that he misrepresents Ambrose multiple times, as we went over in this stream, and really, it's just this whole thing is terrible. So with that, let's see if anybody has any comments for me. Let's see if there are any comments. One comment, Bookworm Bean, very poor paper, obviously written with the preconception of not liking the Lionheart and twists everything to fit it. Doesn't understand medieval warfare either. No acknowledgement of the issues Richard faces as king and crusader, knowing John and Philip Augustus are ganging up on him. Exactly. It's just terrible. No context. Basically, it's just a slanderous. It's just a slanderous paper. And which I mentioned at the beginning. You can tell because they refer to Saladin's victory at Hattin as stupendous. And they refer to Richard's amazing victory at Jaffa as, quote, skirmishing along the coast. What is that? It's ridiculous. All right. If there's no other comments, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Obviously, you can feel free to comment on this if you have any other thoughts. Richard has been badly maligned. We will stop the slander. I'm asking the medievalists to take this off of their website because it is terrible. And if you have any other comments or thoughts, I will probably be releasing another thread on Richard shortly. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch you on the next one.